Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Our webinar will get started in just a few minutes as people are still getting connected. While we're waiting to start, I'm going to launch a poll here that we'd like you all to answer just to the best of your knowledge. You'll see one question and you can select an answer, and we will look at those results a little bit later. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. This is the Link Center's conversation with people with disabilities about sexual violence and a call to action for state agencies. We've launched a poll here at the start that we'd like you to answer just to the best of your knowledge. You'll see one question and you can select your answer, and we'll look at those results in a few minutes. Before we get started today, I want to provide some housekeeping information about our Zoom webinar platform, as well as how you can interact with us throughout the session. We do have live captioning and ASL interpreters present today. The session will be recorded and the recording will be shared after the webinar. The PowerPoint and any links that we share today will also be shared with everyone after the webinar. Attendees cannot see the names of other attendees and all attendees are muted. You can use the chat function in Zoom to communicate with other attendees and with the host and panelists in the webinar. You can use the chat by clicking on chat at the bottom of your screen. Please be aware that your name will appear in the chat if you make a comment, and you can always change your display name by clicking on the three little dots next to your name and selecting rename. We will have panelists watching the chat and responding throughout the session. If you'd like to submit a question or a comment privately to the host and panelists, you can do that by clicking on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and you can submit those anonymously. We will be spotlighting the active speaker and the ASL interpreter throughout the webinar. And if you click on if you click on view on your Zoom screen, you can change the way you see the panelists. And if you're having any trouble with your view, please let us know in the chat and we will try to help you. So at this time, I am going to hand the floor over to Jennifer Johnson. She is the Acting Commissioner of the Administration on Disabilities at the Administration for Community Living. Ms. Johnson, the floor is yours.
Hello, I am Jennifer Johnson, and I am the Acting Commissioner for the Administration on Disabilities, which is part of the Administration for Community Living. I am a middle-aged white woman with hair that goes just below my shoulders. It's salt and pepper gray. It's straight, and today I'm wearing a button-down sleeveless shirt and have on some earrings as well as a necklace, and I have a virtual background that is blue with the ACL logo in the corner. I first want to share a little bit about the Administration for Community Living, or ACL, for those who are not familiar with us. We are part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and our mission is to ensure that people of all people, regardless of age or disability or level of support need, can fully live and participate in their communities. And we were created about 12 years ago, and we brought together both disability and aging programs, recognizing the commonalities between older adults and people with disabilities in terms of needing access to community services and supports to be able to live well in the community, as well as some of the discrimination, whether it's ableism, ageism, or a combination that these communities face. So we were again created to really advocate and promote community living for older adults and people with disabilities. Under ACL, I work for the Administration on Disabilities, or AOD, and we administer a number of cross-disability programs that promote independent living for people with disabilities. I'm really pleased that so many of you are joining us today. It's remarkable the turnout number we have here for this webinar. This is such an important discussion that we're having today regarding sexual violence and its impact on people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We know that people with IDD, and I know there were some poll questions, so I may be giving away some of the answers, but that they're sexually assaulted at a staggering rate, and they experience sexual violence again at a staggering rate. We think it's at least 7 times that of people without disabilities, and that is likely an undercount. And people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in particular are more likely to be sexually assaulted by someone they know at any time of day and in all settings. So it's really vital that we are raising awareness that this is happening to people with IDD. And while it might be hard to hear the stories about that sexual violence, it is really just so important that we share these stories and that we listen to these stories that we can start to bring an end to this violence against people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We are especially pleased that in partnership with key federal partners, the Link Center is hosting this webinar. The Link Center is a project of national significance that we are funding and is led by the National Association of State Directors of Developmental Disability Services, or NASDs. They are working in partnership with the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors, the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators, and NAD, or NADD, which is formerly the National Association of Dual Diagnosis. The goal of the Link Center is to improve access to mental health services for people with IDD, brain injury, and other cognitive disabilities. I would also like to thank all of our federal partners for their leadership in this important work and in bringing you this webinar today. And I'd especially like to thank Liz Rosenthal from the Office of Gender-Based Violence within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, as well as our colleagues from the Administration for Children and Families, the HHS Office of Civil Rights, and the Department of Justice, who have all made tremendous contributions to this work. In particular, I'd also like to thank Nancy Smith from Activating Change for her important work in this area. And last but most importantly, I'd like to thank James Meadors and Cindy Bentley, who are willing to share with us today their personal experiences, because again, it's so important that we do hear those personal stories to really understand what is happening, but also the impact of sexual violence against people with IDD and the importance of supporting their recovery. I hope their stories and the resources shared today will help you in providing much needed supports and trauma-informed mental health care to victims of sexual assault with disabilities. Victims with disabilities who have been experienced sexual assault, which right now are very difficult for them to obtain in their recovery process. We are hosting this webinar so that agencies providing supports in states, and that includes the IDDD agencies and mental health agencies, can gain insights into concrete steps they can take to both prevent and detect instances of such abuse, but most importantly, how to support victims when they have experienced abuse. So I want to thank you for joining us today and taking time out of your busy schedule to join this very important webinar. And we encourage you to stay tuned for follow-up support in this area. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Stacy Nademacher from NASI's and Sherry Dawsons from the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors to introduce our session.
Hi, good afternoon for me in Pennsylvania, to everyone else on here, wherever you're logging in from. Thanks so much, Jennifer. And I am Stacy Nademacher, and I'm here to welcome everyone to, as Jennifer already said, this very important discussion, hoping that we can together take what we hear and learn today to take action tomorrow. Along with our colleagues and partners at NASHBID, and through the work of the Link Center, where we look to bridge systems to support people with co-occurring conditions, we know that preventing and identifying abuse and supporting victims requires cross-system collaboration. We don't need to be doing this alone as we look to move the needle in our state systems to become trauma-informed. The people here today telling their stories and those that we support are all our people. But the most important partnership in this work is the people with lived experience. So we challenge you to listen to that experience today and think about other places to partner to become better poised to build trauma-informed supportive systems who listen to people with disabilities. At the end of today's webinar, be prepared to answer the question, what is the one thing you will do tomorrow as a direct result of what you heard here today? Sherry, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stacy. I'm thrilled to be here as well. The National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors, or we say NASHBID, is really honored to participate as we continue to improve responsiveness, that's so important to survivors with disabilities, those especially experiencing trauma with co-occurring conditions. Stacy had a great question, and I think we can also ask ourselves, how can I be an even more vital partner as we build connections, no matter where you live, state, local, federal level, and take those opportunities to help people with disabilities begin their healing and recovery? There's such power in partnerships. I've seen it, and I know you have too, with federal and state and local systems when champions, and most importantly, the survivors with lived expertise come together and really try and create solutions. The participation wherever you live is so important as we think about the collective action that's necessary in really paving a more accessible, straightforward, quicker path to justice, healing, and recovery. So really thank you for investing your time this afternoon to help people live healthier lives. I had the privilege of watching the last webinar and really witness the strength and resilience of the individuals with lived expertise, James and Cindy, joining us again today. And I know when survivors turn to helpers, the message was clear. They deserve to feel heard and believed. And we as helpers really want to feel prepared to provide a welcoming opportunity for healing and recovery. So as the presenters go today, we'll really encourage you to, again, to think about those opportunities for collaboration to continue to build a trauma responsive system for survivors with disabilities. I know the topic today is going to be somewhat maybe intense for some of us. And so we really want to respect and for you to have permission and for you just to have a reminder about your well-being. So during this webinar, because we'll be discussing the sexual violence and survivors will be sharing their experiences, If you have difficulty with this information, we really encourage you to just take care of yourself and feel free to step away, mute the audio, turn away from your screen. We're going to be dropping links in for national hotlines in the chat in case you need to talk with someone as a result of this webinar. So just really focus on your own well-being as well. And now it's my privilege to introduce Nancy Smith from Activating Change. Nancy?
Thank you so much, Sherry. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today. We are at Activating Change incredibly honored to be a part of this this very important conversation. And I'd also like to take a moment to thank everyone for joining us and for demonstrating your commitment to ending abuse of people with disabilities and also to supporting survivors of sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence. My name is Nancy Smith, and I am the Executive Director of Activating Change. I am a white, gender non-conforming woman with brown hair in a mohawk. I am wearing a white shirt. There is a white wall with decorative prints to my left and also behind me. There is also a cabinet with shelves and some decorative items, including photos of really cute dogs behind me. Activating Change is a national nonprofit, and our work focuses on ending the widespread victimization and mass incarceration of people with disabilities and deaf people. Through our work, we support people with disabilities, victim service providers, disability advocates, criminal justice personnel, and others to prevent and disrupt violence and abuse of people with disabilities, to remove barriers to services and healing that are often rooted, as we'll discuss in a moment, in ableism, autism, and racism and other forms of oppression. And we also work to create pathways for safety and healing for survivors with disabilities and deaf survivors. We'd like to start off today's event by providing an overview of what we know about sexual violence against people with disabilities and the experiences that survivors, in particular survivors with intellectual and developmental disabilities, experience when accessing services in the aftermath of violence. As Sherry mentioned, this topic is heavy. It can be difficult. So I'd like to also encourage you, especially for those of us who have experienced sexual violence firsthand, to take care of yourself during this webinar. And I wanted to let everyone know that we have someone available if you need additional support. Leah Green is on chat and is available here if you'd like some support or resources or to speak with someone directly. You can reach out to her directly through the chat and be connected with her. So I saw early on, we started with a poll that was asking about sort of the incidence and prevalence. So how often is sexual assault occurring both among children and adults with disabilities? And as Jennifer stated at the beginning, the rates are staggering. And what we see across the board in terms of the limited research that's available is that people with disabilities are much more likely than people without to experience sexual assault. And again, that is both as children and as adults. One thing I'd say before I share a little bit more in terms of what the research tells us is that there is pretty limited research in this area. And so there's a lot of variability in the research that exists, and there's a lot of gaps in the research. So keep that in mind as we share the research. And as Jennifer shared in the beginning, the research in most cases is underreporting what is actually happening. And the research itself, the rates are incredibly staggering. And again, we believe this to be an undercount of what is actually occurring in the lives of people with disabilities. As many of you probably know, 1 in 4 people in the United States has a disability, and people with disabilities are 3 to 5 times more likely than people without disabilities to experience violent victimization, which includes sexual assault. So again, this is looking at victimization more broadly. When we look more specifically at sexual victimization, we do see very high rates of sexual victimization. So people with disabilities have higher rates of lifetime and past year sexual assault. Depending on the research that you look at, those rates are anywhere between 2 to 4 times that of people without disabilities. And again, this is looking at people with disabilities, which is a very broad group of people as a whole. When we look at specific types of disabilities, so people with cognitive disabilities, for example, we see much higher rates. One study found that 83% of people with cognitive disabilities who were interviewed indicated that they had experienced sexual assault, either as a child or as an adult. And we do see in the limited research that the sort of prevalence, how often sexual assault occurs among people with disabilities, does vary by some important characteristics. So we do see that women with disabilities experience higher rates of sexual assault. So one study, for example, found that 2 in 5 women who had experienced sexual assault had a disability at the time in which the sexual assault occurred. So again, we see a heightened risk and higher rates of sexual assault among women with disabilities. We also see high rates of sexual assault among men with disabilities. So nearly 1 in 4 male victims who had experienced sexual violence had indicated that they had a disability at the time of that sexual assault. So again, 2 in 5 women survivors of sexual assault had a disability, and 1 in 4 male survivors of sexual assault indicated that they had a disability. As we mentioned before, research demonstrates that people with cognitive disabilities have just staggering rates and experiences of sexual violence. One study found that 83% of female victims were the victims of sexual assault, and a third of adult males with cognitive disabilities were the victims of sexual assault. We also see very high rates of sexual violence among people with mental health concerns. So one study found that people with psychiatric disabilities were experiencing sexual violence at rates at least 2 times greater than people without psychiatric disabilities. Again, this is thought to be an undercount just because of the systemic barriers that are limiting research generally around abuse of people with disabilities, but then also that are limiting who can actually participate in research, given that research itself is often, some research is often inaccessible for many people with disabilities to participate in. In addition to having much higher rates of sexual violence, we also know, both from lived experiences of people with disabilities who've experienced sexual violence and research, that survivors with disabilities experience unique dynamics, both in terms of the sexual violence that they're experiencing and also in terms of their experiencing reaching out for victim services and other types of support. As Jennifer mentioned early on, one of those dynamics is that the vast majority of people who are responsible for sexual violence and abuse in the lives of people with disabilities are known to the victim. And this is very common, and it is analogous to the experience of people without disabilities. So there's similarity there in terms of the experiences of people with disabilities and people without disabilities. And often the person or persons responsible are in positions of power or in authority. What is unique to people with disabilities is that almost half of the people responsible for sexual violence and abuse has a relationship with the survivor because of the survivor's disability. So this could be an accessible transportation provider. It could be an occupational therapist. It could be someone who's working in a group home. It could also be a personal care attendant, either a paid personal care attendant or someone who is a family member providing those services. So again, about half of the people responsible are often in paid positions of care and support for people with disabilities. There are other unique dynamics, and I'll just sort of lift up a few. I know that our panelists who will be going after me will be talking a little bit more about their own experiences with sexual violence. So just want to kind of put those into a larger context. But the experiences of people with disabilities, both in terms of sort of the factors that contribute to this heightened risk of sexual violence, and then also some of the factors that make it difficult, create sort of systemic barriers to reporting and systemic barriers to reaching out for services, are sort of one and the same often. We know, for example, that many people with disabilities live in isolated settings. That could be in a setting such as an institution. It could be in a group home. It also could be in the community, but due to social segregation, there may not be a lot of opportunities for that person to connect with the broader community outside of their home. And certainly living in isolation really creates a invisibility, which can allow for violence and abuse to occur in a way that is uninterrupted. And also when you're isolated, it is a lot harder to reach out for help and to receive support. Another unique dynamic that I want to sort of lift up is the culture of compliance. And so that also is sort of a culture that exists actually in many sort of direct service organizations or programs for people with disabilities, where many people, especially with intellectual disabilities, will talk about sort of growing up, and this could be in the home, but it also can be in disability service provider organizations, where essentially compliance, so agreeing with people who are in positions of authority, taking direction from people is something that is rewarded. And I think that this is something in our culture and in our society broadly that exists for people with disabilities and people without disabilities, but it is certainly one that is more pronounced for people with especially intellectual disabilities, and also to some extent people with psychiatric disabilities, where you are seen as good if you take medication. You are good if you are following directions. And so growing up, that often does not create room for people to be able to have their own voice and to consent to things that are happening to them. We also know that there is a widespread denial of information to people with disabilities, in particular people with intellectual and cognitive disabilities, about boundaries, relationships, healthy sexuality. There is sort of a baseline assumption within our society that people with disabilities are asexual. There is also a prevailing, sort of framework that infantilizes people with disabilities, sort of sees people with disabilities as young, adults with disabilities as young. And those, among other sort of factors, kind of conspire to create this environment in which we don't teach relationships and sexuality, or even baseline information about our bodies or language about our body parts to people with disabilities, which again is a very significant barrier to people understanding their bodies, understanding their experiences, and then also being able to reach out to be able to describe what is happening to them. And so if we're not talking about healthy sexuality and boundaries and relationships, we're also not talking about sexual violence. And we hear again and again from survivors with disabilities that they simply lacked the language to describe their own bodies, but also to describe what is happening to them. And then a couple other dynamics that I just want to name is that there also is a lack of confidentiality and a lack of autonomy in many people's lived experience in day-to-day lives. And for example, guardianship, we know that not all people with disabilities have guardians, but some people with disabilities do have guardians. And there's quite a variety in terms of the nature of the guardianship. But having a guardian, you could have a guardian that is making medical decisions, that is, playing a role in terms of, the services that you receive. And that right there can limit the autonomy that a person has in terms of reaching out for help, and also being able to do so in a way that is confidential, where you don't have sort of a third person involved in the sort of decision to receive or consent to receive services, or even being in the space when you're talking about your experiences and the type of support that you need. And that is a real unique dynamic that some people with disabilities experience. We also know similarly that every state across the country has mandatory reporting laws, and disability organizations have their own mandatory reporting processes. These laws were really put in place in order to ensure that people who are unable to receive services and support and were in need of safety and protection could get that. In many cases, mandatory reporting applies much broader, and we have many people with disabilities who are subject to mandatory reporting. And so they may reach out and disclose that they've experienced abuse. But because of mandatory reporting, they then lose their autonomy and can lose their decision making in what happens next and who else knows about what has happened. And that can create increased risk for someone. We know that the people responsible for harm can increase violence once there is, some type of intervention. It also can remove people from the homes that they live in order to quote unquote go somewhere safer. But in all of that, it is often people are losing their autonomy and they're losing their decision making. And one of the things that the research really shows in terms of healing from any type of violence, but in particular interpersonal and sexual violence, it is so critical because of the dynamics of those where control is often taken away from someone, that survivors, as much as possible, maintain their voice, being able to tell their own story and being able to choose who they're telling their story to, and then also being able to have choice and autonomy in what happens and in the services that they receive or in sort of the aftermath of violence. And mandatory reporting, while well-meaning, is definitely in tension and at odds with what we know that people need in order to heal from violence. So those are just a few of the unique dynamics. Those, as I mentioned earlier, sort of conspire not only to create a heightened risk, but also to create barriers to reporting. And for many people with disabilities, many survivors with disabilities, help is simply out of reach. And there's not a lot of research on the experiences that survivors with disabilities have when reaching out. But the one sort of study that does exist really demonstrates just how out of reach safety and healing is for many survivors with disabilities. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, only 1 in 10 survivors with disabilities receive support from a victim service organization. So most survivors with disabilities have no formal support to help them sort of navigate sort of the experiences of violence and that process of sort of increasing safety and healing and justice. And I believe we have another poll that we'd like to put up if possible. So our next poll here is a barrier that can prevent individuals from disclosing sexual violence or seeking help is lack of sex education, fear of retaliation or adverse consequences, concerns that they won't be believed, they don't know how to report or who to tell, or all of the above. We'll just give a minute or so for you to answer the poll.
Answers are still rolling in, so I'll get it another minute.
Great. And this is an opportunity, just another invitation for everyone to take care of themselves during this webinar. This is very heavy. It can be difficult. If you need to take a break, you want to mute your line, you need to step away from your computer, please feel free to do that. And again, if you would like some resources or you would like to speak to someone directly, Leah Green is available on the webinar. You can reach out in the chat and connect with Leah directly. All right, so it looks like our poll results are in, and 96% of everyone on this webinar indicated all of the above, which is absolutely the case. There are sort of a myriad of barriers that people with disabilities experience that really create these systemic barriers to safety and healing and justice. We've talked about some of these already. But we know that in our culture and our communities, people with disabilities are systematically devalued, infantilized, not seen as credible, so they're not believed when they do come forward to disclose violence. We systematically withhold information about relationships and sexuality. And we also create very isolated conditions, living conditions and environments. And then layering onto that, we know that many community-based programs are not designed with survivors with disabilities at the center. So victim service programs such as rape crisis centers and domestic violence programs are often inaccessible. So there are communication, physical, attitudinal barriers that people with disabilities experience. We also know that disability organizations are not often designed to be trauma informed. So they are not, their policies and procedures aren't designed to provide a sort of healing informed, trauma informed response that helps survivors in their sort of healing journey. And then lastly, in most communities, we know that victim service organizations and disability organizations are not working together to support survivors with disabilities. As a result of this, and then also another layer, we know that systems themselves, such as the criminal legal system, is inaccessible. And for many people, people with disabilities, people without disabilities, the criminal legal system is often re-traumatizing and it is ineffective. This is particularly true for survivors with disabilities from Black and Brown communities. Again, limited research on the criminal legal system's response to survivors with disabilities, but the research that is out there does demonstrate this an ineffective approach. Only 9% of cases involving survivors with disabilities result in a conviction. So a small percentage of cases actually result in a conviction. And we hear from survivors with disabilities, again, especially from Black and Brown communities, just how inaccessible the system is and how re-traumatizing the response is. There are some bright spots. One of them is that across the country, there's a growing network of providers, both disability advocates and victim service providers and self-advocates who are across the country, who are removing barriers, and they are providing services to survivors with disabilities that are accessible, trauma-informed, and culturally responsive. And we see a couple of things in those communities. And one of our panelists, Teresa, is going to talk a little bit more about these characteristics. But in these communities, in this sort of growing network, what we see is that disability organizations and victim service providers are intentionally building their capacity and enhancing their services to meet the needs of survivors with disabilities. This is everything from ensuring that they have policies and procedures that support an accessible, trauma-informed, culturally responsive response. It's ensuring that they have the financial resources that are necessary, that staff are trained on the policies and the procedures and how to access financial resources when they're needed. And one of the things that we see is this sort of capacity building that's happening looks a little different if you're in a disability organization versus a victim service organization. Disability organizations are really working on having a more trauma-informed response to disclosures. So for example, we mentioned mandatory reporting. Many disability organizations have policies and protocols when someone discloses abuse to file mandatory reporting, to file a report with Adult Protective Services in their community. And one of the things that we see in organizations that are providing more of an effective response is that they are working with their staff across their organization so that the response does not stop with a mandatory report, but instead the advocates and staff of that organization are working with survivor to figure out ways that they can sort of continue to support their healing beyond a mandatory report. So what are the options, either within that organization or within a victim service organization, that can continue to provide support and healing services and advocacy and access to justice for that person. So again, it doesn't just stop at mandatory reporting. And that's just one sort of concrete example of what sort of disability organizations in this sort of broad network that's emerging are working on. Similarly, in victim service organizations, the capacity building work there really focuses on increasing accessibility and tailoring services to meet the lived experiences of survivors with disabilities. So we see in these communities where services are more effective and better meeting the needs of survivors with disabilities, this intentional capacity building within disability and victim service organizations. We also see that those organizations, those disability organizations and victim service organizations are forging collaborations and they're working together. So one of the things that is often happening in communities that's really wonderful is that there's a lot of opportunities for co-training. So disability organizations can train victim service staff and help increase their accessibility. And on the other side of the coin, victim service organizations can help bring that trauma-informed lens into disability organizations. But in addition, with sort of that basis of collaboration, there's more opportunities for co-advocacy. So if a survivor reaches out to a victim service organization as being served and they need a specific accommodation, that advocate has a connection in a disability organization to help them think about how they can meet that accommodation need, for example. And then lastly, what we see in these communities is that they are actively involving self-advocates, leaders from the self-advocacy movement, people with disabilities themselves in these efforts. And that both is in terms of the capacity building efforts to remove these barriers and to sort of transform our responses and our services and our systems. But it's also cultivating self-advocates to provide peer support. So to provide support and advocacy to other people with disabilities who've experienced sexual violence. And today we are really delighted to be joined by two leaders from the self-advocacy movement who have really dedicated their work to ending sexual violence and other forms of violence among people with disabilities. And I am honored to turn things over to Sandra Harrell from Activating Change, who is going to facilitate a survivor circle for the next portion of this event. Sandra?
This is Sandra. I want to welcome Cindy and James to please turn on your cameras and your microphones. Hi, James.
Hey,
And hey, Cindy.
Hello.
So I'm gonna introduce myself real quick, and then I'm gonna ask each of you to introduce yourselves, okay? So my name is Sandra Harrell. I'm the Director of Field and Capacity Building at Activating Change. I'm a white woman with blonde, short hair, and I'm wearing dark rimmed glasses. My shirt is, I don't know what color it is. It's something between a dark blue and a dark green, but I can't really determine that. And I have a blurred background. Cindy, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Cindy Bentley. I'm the Executive Director of People First of Wisconsin with an intellectual disability. Sorry, I'm a little froggy, allergies, but a little, and I'm wearing a white sweater with flower shirt and blue shorts and Crocs, little with, yeah, so that's what I'm wearing, and a necklace and earrings.
Thank you, Cindy. James, a quick
Welcome.
introduction of yourself as well.
sure. I'm James Smathers. I am from San Antonio, Texas. And I'm a person with he and him. And I'm a person have a blue and white dress shirt, a blue tie, and underneath my dress shirt, I have a Superman shirt underneath. But I've been a long time self-advocate leader of the movement. But the last 7 years, I've been working more helping those who've been hurt by sexual assault as a sexual assault survivor, and can't wait to talk to you today.
I forgot one thing. I'm also from Wisconsin.
This is Sandra. Thank you both so much for
Yeah.
being here.
You're welcome.
You know, as Nancy mentioned, one of the key ways that people can really be able to start transforming their own services is by really hearing from survivors with disabilities and understanding your unique experiences. And so we are so grateful for both of you coming here today and being willing to open up and share those experiences with us. We talked about sort of how we would do this. So I will ask Cindy, I know that we did a brief description of yourself, but maybe say a lot more about yourself, about your work at People First and sort of what brings you.
I'm the executive director. I work, it's a statewide advocacy group. It goes from Milwaukee all the way up to Rhinelander in Wisconsin. I have 6 staff. I have, they're all advocates. I have an office assistants and 2 fundraisers. We advocate for lots of changes. We do not want people living segregated. We work on transportation. We work on affordable housing and to make sure people are connected in their community. And I do a lot of stuff. This week, right now as we speak, I'm up in Madison, working with our youth for the week. So I stepped away so I can help you and tell my story. And then I'm going right back to it.
Thank
You're
you,
welcome.
Cindy. I really appreciate hearing all about, because I think one of the important things for our audience to keep in mind is that people, as we talked about last week when we
Yes,
were
ma'am.
chatting together, people are more than just the sexual assault, right? That like you are more than that, and you have so much more to offer than
Yeah, I'm a person, and
Yep.
I will say I was also in a state institution, not because I wanted to be in the state institution. It was back when I was born. My mother had lots of issues and had a lot of family problems. I wasn't supposed to live They gave me 24 hours to live. And then I was abused at the center, and tell you more when you want me to talk about that.
Yeah, let's hear a little bit more from James about
Okay.
what
Yeah.
brings you here, James, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Cindy.
Okay, no problem.
So James, can you say more about yourself? I know that you've been doing self-advocacy work for decades, and then what brought you into the work around sexual assault?
Well, Joe Shapiro, who's a reporter from National Public Radio, asked if I was interested to talk about Abuse Portray series for him. And we talk about it, and we've been talking to him longest time. Me and another colleague of mine been trying to tell him, so you need to talk about this issue because it's not been heard yet in the world. And if he finally got the opportunity that he asked me to share my story as a sexual assault survivor because I've assaulted multiple times in my lifetime. And this is the first time I shared my story to the world about how I deal with my assault experience. Because from the early days to my last one, throughout my story, I'm going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly about my assault. Because it's important to hear survivor stories, but also to help leaders like myself, if they want to devote their life to help others who've been hurt sexual assault, you should get the support they need to let them to share their story. Sometimes emotional, sometimes draining, and oftentimes it's powerful because it's important. It's just not just one person sharing their story. It's neat to have different perspectives of stuff.
Yeah, this is Sandra, and I think that's such an important point to make, James, because I think, you know, Nancy had talked about the ways that we tend as a society to treat people with disabilities as like permanent children, right? And sometimes because we treat people with disabilities, or we think of people with disabilities as permanent children, we're afraid to have them talk about the things that have happened to them because we're like trying to protect them from their own feelings. But like you said, like you can feel sad about what happened to you. You can be sad that you can be angry about what happened to you, and still telling your story can be very, very powerful. So I just really appreciate you both being here today, being willing to share that. And with that, Cindy, I wonder if you would mind sharing a little bit about what happened to you. Oh, you're muted, my friend.
Yeah, sorry, I was coughing. Then I said I should just. So I'm gonna go step right into this. So while I was at the Southern Center down in Union Grove, Wisconsin, I was very young when this happened to me. I hadn't even had sex education class. And somebody that's supposed to have been taking care of me came in the room and did terrible things, very terrible things. And this person told me, if I said anything, I'll kill you. Of course, you're little. I was under 8 years old. So when this happened, and so I just believed that I shouldn't say anything. He did this millions of times. And then what happened was, as I got older, I could not let this keep happening. So when I was 26 years old, I was discharged out of Southern at 26 to move back to my hometown, Milwaukee. And so before I left, I didn't want anybody else to have to go through what I'd gone through. So I went to the administration office and told them what exactly happened. And what really rolled the ball, I have a good memory. I know where some of this is, it went off. So he took me off the grounds and wasn't supposed to be doing it. So I'm just gonna take you for a ride. And he says, you can't tell anybody. And he always would have candy or something. So And so I remembered the hotel, every detail. So they believed me, thank heavens, because I had the proof, even after all these years of this stuff happening to me. And so they got the receipts from this hotel. And then, as I was moving into the group home, our police, Milwaukee police, and the detective talked to me in Milwaukee, and then they got the Union Grove police in Racine to talk, and he went to prison. And I was so glad that I got justice, and I was only 26 years old, almost going to be 27. But I still have the trauma. I will always have the trauma. If you ask anybody knows me, I have my guards up. It's hard for me to still trust people. I should be able to, but I keep saying, I always have to ask them, I'm doing good. Did I do something wrong, or did I make somebody mad or whatever? And I just celebrated 40 years out of the institution, two big parties. And I still questioned myself about, did I even deserve these parties? I know I did, but I'm always second guessing and you know what I mean. And so to this day, I know today I wanted to do this. And the reason why I keep doing this is because I want to educate people what is happening in the state institutions. We still have 2 institutions that should be closed. We don't know what's going on behind the doors, but back in my head, I do know there's abuse out there. You can't tell me they're not getting abused in either one of those centers. And so until I go over the rainbow, until they close those institutions, I am going to be fighting for their civil rights. They don't have a voice right now. They all tell people with disabilities, I kept on hearing it, and then my other friends say the same thing. Just get over it. No, this didn't happen to you. It happens in Milwaukee too. Understandable. I am just so passionate about this. I know what happened to me, and it should not even happen to me as a child. Didn't even know anything about sex or anything. And I never wanted to go through this again. I think if this would ever happen to me again, I don't know what, I think I just would die if this happened to me again. I thought about this last night. And so what the story I want to tell today is, sorry, I have a little allergy, sorry. But I am definitely passionate. We want police and everybody to protect us. They're supposed to protect us, not say get over it or you're making it up or you just want attention. Absolutely not. And I feel that I'm an African American woman, and I'm a smart African woman, and we're supposed to protect our people, not only people that are of color, but we're supposed to protect everybody. And I see something wrong, it's going to be reported. And I'm going to say, don't you tell me, get over it. I'm not over all the trauma I have. I still got it. Yes, I talk about it. Every time I tell my story, I feel better. I feel so much better. And I have people backing me. And another thing I think is really good. People love me. I wasn't loved in an institution, because if I was, none of this would have happened to me in the first place. And so what else I found, I was at a rummage sale last week. We were just at a rummage sale, me and my friend. And I found this, I wanted to show this. And I think this is what's going to help me get through the rest of my life with this. You know how you don't let go of things, but it says here, let go and let God. I don't usually, but this was the most, of all the rummage sales I found, I found this at a rummage sale, only charged me a few cents for this thing. And so this is going to be my, how would you say it? Yeah, my motto, because God would never let anything like this happen to anybody. So now God is telling me in me, I need to let go of the trauma of it, but also still fight for what I believe in. And I'm not gonna let nobody tell me to, to get over it, because I'm not gonna get over it. They didn't go through what I went through as
Yeah,
as a child. And I just wanted to tell you, that's all I wanted to say, but this is what I wanted. I wanted this part to be powerful.
it was so powerful, Sydney. And you're getting a lot of love in the chat. If you need to take a sip of water
Oh,
for the
no, I just need to take some water. So if James
Yeah.
wants to talk a
Let's
minute,
give
please
James
do.
the floor. James, I think one of the reasons we so appreciate you bringing your voice into this conversation is that, as you talk about a lot of men with disabilities have these experiences, but they are not encouraged to talk about them. And you are brave and you talk about your experiences. So can you share a little bit about your own story?
Sure. Like I said earlier, that I'm a sexual assault multiple times in my lifetime. And I'm going to talk about my high school years to my last assault, 2005. In my high school youth, I was in 10th grade. And I knew I was different from the other kids because I had gone to school across town than the typical kids. I was in a special education wing. And a group of girls invited me to come over their house. So, okay, they were in the neighborhood high school, and they were trying to invite me. I said, okay, I come over, have fun time. But instead they decide to use me. And I know some of the words I use is strong, but they used me like a toy, like a sex toy, to assaulted me. But at the time, I did not know what sexual assault was. I did not know what's when you go inside a person. And I remember a movie back in the day called Bad Boys. It's, I think, one of Sean Penn's earliest movies he ever done. And I did not know what rape was until his girlfriend got assaulted by the gang member of a rally gang members. Because when we watch rape on television, the screen turned dark. You never know what happened to that person. And when I saw that, I said, oh my gosh, I got assaulted. And for me, I felt like I have no power because I didn't have no authority figure to talk to. I didn't feel safe with my parents because my dad is from the South, the Deep South. And sometimes guys in the Deep South keep everything private inside of them. And that's how I got taught it, to hold it inside me. And years later, I got assaulted again. Then I felt powerless again because no one believed me at the workshop program where I was working. By 2004, I got assaulted this time, but this time I stand up for myself. I signed a person who was deaf. His name is Jay. And I tell him, no, no. I saw him, no, 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 no. He didn't listen to me. And that Monday, when I gone back to work, and some of my friends was worried about me because I wasn't acting myself. And that Tuesday, my friend Barry who was the local director of the Arcopat Reach, asked me, "What's wrong with you? You not seem like yourself." And I went to the hospital, and this was the first time I went to a sexual assault nurse examination. And that was hard because they did some examinations I'm not used to. And I have a friend named Amy who go with me to the hospital, and I have some boundaries for her to be there and not to be there. When they do the medical exam, some parts they need to do it in the nude, and she respect my boundary, and because she was married, and I didn't feel comfortable for her in the examination when they do the other new parts of my body for the examination. And she was real nice and kind because she took one step at a time. Not rush it, just take one step at a time. When she called the sex crimes unit at the police department, and she talked to someone and said, "I need a guy who is like a teddy bear inside. Because this person, me, needs someone who is gentle inside." Because it was the first time all these feelings came out of my old result to my last result, was that it's so powerful. And I told her, I want to promise myself, I want to change the world of sexual assault right now, right then. But Miss Wanda helped me realize, James, you need to recover first before you change the world. It took several years to do that. And now I'm glad I'm what I'm doing now because it's feeling good and more at peace of myself whenever a professional group or a sexual assault nurses AMA group, it helped me to be much stronger inside.
Thank you so much, James. And thank you so much, Cindy. We are running a little short on time, so I wanted to
You're welcome.
a few things that a few of the points that y'all have made already for our audience. I mean, I think Cindy, your point of like how healing it was for you to just be believed and that people actually pursued justice for you was so important. So believing survivors when they tell you that something happened, like you said, Cindy, I believe them. It's so important to just believe them. And James, I think that, you know, so many points that you made, but the importance of healing, the importance of boundaries, the importance of people respecting your boundaries, especially after a sexual assault. I think so often the world, when they are talking to somebody with a disability who's experienced sexual assault, they sort of want to impose their will onto what should happen. And I love that your friend and Wanda didn't do that. They let you make the choices about what you wanted to do. So in a very short amount of time, I wonder if each of you could say one or two other things you need service providers to walk away from this conversation with. And I'll start, James, with you and then Cindy.
Okay, I think one way is just listen. The key is listening and to believe and not play the blame game.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you listen people, what they're saying is true, and it's hard and difficult, and at the same time, it could be emotional for them. And because without these two things, listen and hearing and see people's reaction, because sometimes they use words to describe things, but sometimes their body language tell them also different how they react when they talk about this very sensitive issue.
Yes.
It makes me sad when I see not just for people with disabilities. I know I told you our group before our phone call today is that I take things personally, especially those who got hurt by sexual assault. Sometimes I get mad at television because the lack of evidence is not enough to prosecute that person who commit that crime.
Mhm.
And the other thing is great is that we need to have people like Miss Wanda, who is the sexual assault nurses at Amherst, to really take the time to hear persons out. Sometimes it may take a couple hours. Sometimes it take a half a day.
Yep.
You really need to take the pace to help that person.
Thank
And
you.
because it's important and we need to be heard.
And there are so many other things I know, James, that you want to share, but I want to make sure Cindy gets to share
I know,
a
I
little bit
understand.
as well. But thank you so much. And Cindy?
Yes, I want you on this line to understand is that when somebody comes to you, even if they're living with their parents or not, or group home, you are there to serve, not make a judgment. And you're also there to love them. It only takes a moment for a person to be loved. I still feel that, you guys are service advisors. You got in this field because you care. That's the only way I can think of this. I thought about this last night too. And service advisors, you're there to not judge, but you are there to listen. And you got to be patient. Somebody may not have the complete language like I'm able to speak. Sometimes you have to take your time. Don't look at your watch. Don't say get over it, but really investigate. And don't just say you're going to investigate or I'm going to look into this. Really look into it. Really look into it. And the second thing I'm going to leave you with is people with intellectual disabilities all my life since I was born, I think. If I was listened to as a kid, I had no choice how I came in this world. Okay? And I had no other choice of somebody else violating my body. But now I have choices. And for being shut up for over 40 years with this. And I always thought I was the bad person. I'm going to cry now. I thought I was the bad person, but I'm scarred for life. I am scarred for life. And it's hard for me to get close to people because I'm always thinking, oh, they're just hurting me or they're going to hurt me or something. I used to sleep in my apartment I'm in now, been there. I used to put a chair to the door. And so I thought I would be saved. I don't do that now. But anything trauma that happens to me, everything comes back. I have to live with this. I'm walking on the street, but people don't know what I've been through. And you don't know what another person with a disability has been through. But you service providers are like their mother and father. You gotta be there for them. Some don't have no family members. And when the ones they do have, sometimes they're not the best for them. And you've got to really listen. If they have a communication board or whatever, they said this happened, it happened. No one's gonna make anything like this up. And I ever hear a service provider say, get over it. I'm gonna tell you in a nice way, don't use that kind of language. That is not a people first language. Get over it. Now you can get over a headache, that's different. Your headache will go away. You don't get over what just happened to your body, not at all.
That's right.
And that's all I'm gonna say. I just wanted to get that point to them. I want to get to their hearts. I'm on here because I care. And I love our young people, I love our older people, and I love our elderly people, and they also get. So that's all I want to say. Just give them a little love. That's all they need. And then please listen. Don't put the records in a file and forget about it.
That's
You
right.
wouldn't do that to your own kids. So why would you do it with somebody with a disability? Thank you. That's all I got to say.
Got some amens coming in the chat. Thank you both so much. I wish we had all day.
That's okay, I'm fine.
To both of you. But everything that you shared was just so impactful, and I hope our participants like took from your experiences and will incorporate that into their responses. Paying attention not just to what people say, but how people are acting as well. I think, James, is another important point that both you and Cindy have made. And with that, I want to welcome my old friend Teresa Tudor to join. And Cindy, James, and I will go off camera now and welcome Teresa.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I'm Teresa Tudor. I'm a white middle-aged female. I've got short brunette hair and I'm wearing glasses. And I have been involved in this work, meaning the intersection of violence and people with disabilities for over 20 years. And it has been an exciting and challenging journey. And I want to share some of the things that I've learned or what it means to me to be a part of this. You know, I come from Illinois. And in Illinois, we started our journey on this by looking at both our disability service system as well as our sexual assault system. And, you know, we knew that we had some awesome service providers throughout the state. We knew we had a strong disability service network. We had a strong rape crisis center network, but oftentimes they were very much siloed. In other words, they didn't work together. And when we talk about survivors of sexual assault, those systems have to become partners in their response. And so we knew that there were some survivors that had wonderful experience, you know, that in terms of the response that they received from their disability service provider, and then ultimately being connected with the local rape crisis center. But what we wanted to accomplish was to make sure that it wasn't just a one-time thing. It wasn't just a luck of the draw, that it truly was the systemic approach that any survivor at any time could expect to receive. And that meant we needed to build upon the strengths that we already have. I want to share just a few of the highlights of things that I think are most important that we looked at. If you'll go ahead and move to the next slide, please. So the 4 areas I want to talk about briefly, the first one being assessment, next identification, followed by response, and lastly, sustainability. So let's start with assessment. So one of the things that we knew that we needed to start with was really a vision of where we wanted to be, not where we were then at that time. And when I say at that time, that was back in 2005. We've been working on this partnership for a very long time, making gradual changes across the years. But we wanted to make sure that we had a vision. We created a mission statement that really was the guidepost to where we wanted to be. And we conducted an assessment to see where we are now and then mapped out a path of how to get there. Now, I'll share, this doesn't have to be a formalized needs assessment that meets IRB standards. It's really just getting information from the best sources. Number one, best source would be self-advocates or survivors with disabilities. And so we conducted focus groups and key stakeholder interviews. We did that instead of surveys because many times, and Nancy alluded to this when she talked about the statistics being off because many people with disabilities aren't included in those surveys. They don't have access on how to complete them. And so we did face-to-face. And that really provided the foundation of the work. Now, we also included in our assessment disability service provider feedback, as well as feedback from our local rape crisis centers, key stakeholders at the state level as well. And one of the things that we found out, to me, that to this day, almost 20 years later, that stood out is one of the questions on the survey was, how big of a problem do you think sexual assault against people with disabilities is? And the most common response was it was a huge problem. And then the follow-up question was, in the last 1 to 2 years, how many survivors with disabilities have you interacted with? And the answer most commonly given was 0 or 1. How could it be a huge problem and yet no one's seeing them? So that kind of guided us to the path of looking at identification. So if you'll move to the next slide, please. So with identification, we really wanted to see what got in the way of people being able to see on a big level that it was a huge problem, but not be able to see with the individuals that they work with and supported on a daily basis. And so, asking ourselves, are they equipped? Are disability service staff equipped to identify sexual assault, even a recent event or a historical trauma? And if not, what were some of the barriers that got in the way of this? And I challenge you to ask these questions of your state and your system as well. And then, of course, what type of resources might be needed in order to make that change? And so some of the things that we did in it is to start on that path is to really look at reviewing our assessment tools, our service planning tools, and making revisions to help us get better at identifying sexual assault. And then to integrate it into our service plan. So it wasn't that sexual assault was a standalone incident, that instead it was incorporated into the work that we did in our disability service system. We trained staff across the state on how to identify sexual assault beyond disclosure. What do I see that might be a behavioral indicator? How do I follow up on that in terms of asking questions and providing support, et cetera? Changes in patterns or behaviors, making sure that staff had an avenue for case consultation. Is there a supervisor in the disability service agency, or could I partner with the Rape Crisis Center for them to give case consultation? Because we're not talking about specific victim information. We're asking them to come in and to be experts, and that they can do, and that does not violate confidentiality. We really were looking at how to move beyond diagnosis and having that blur the vision of the trauma indicators in front. And that's what we saw as being one of the big barriers. We included self-advocates in that process as well. How might staff, much like we heard from Sandra's last question to James and to Cindy, is what do you want disability service providers to know? We asked those same types of questions. So we developed toolkits that helped with providing education. There was one for rape crisis centers, one for disability service providers, and one for self-advocates. And that's important because we know that most people are likely to turn to a peer before they turn to a professional. So we wanted to make sure that they were armed with the information and resources that were important. So one of the things that we did with that assessment was also to create a communication book. It was mentioned in the chat as well as in the unique barriers that Nancy covered, is not being able to name what happened, whether it's because a person with a disability doesn't recognize it was sexual assault or may not have the vocabulary in order to tell their story. And so the communication picture book, which was filled with lots of images on sexual activity, so they could point to pictures, tell their story, their voice would be heard. Even if they didn't have the vocabulary, the vocal vocabulary in order to express that. So I'm going to move forward and talk about response, because that is so, so critical. Most of the time when we think about response as state entities, we think about mandatory reporting. And I've seen lots of information in the chat sharing concerns about mandatory reporting. Nancy touched on this when it came to confidentiality. What right does a victim have if the victim has a guardian or the victim is receiving services from a state entity? So certainly taking a look at, are there changes that we can make to the mandatory reporting? I'm really big, and you'll see this in a minute when I talk about sustainability. Policy changes, legislative changes, those are key to sustainability. They're key to making a difference. And that's our role and our responsibility as a state agency, is to make sure we make the changes at the state level to support what's happening at the community level, where the work begins. In other words, what can we do to make it better, and what can we do to stay out of the way of the good work that can happen between a rape crisis center, a disability service provider, and the survivor? So every state under their mandatory reporting has some time frame around that. You know, it might be 4 hours, it might be 24 hours, whatever that hour amount is. I think Cindy said it so beautifully when she said, it only takes a moment to feel loved. If you've got 4 hours to report, you've probably got about 4 minutes to start the healing process. In other words, there's plenty of time to get to the mandatory reporting. What's important is you be right there for the survivor. Do we teach that to our disability service agencies when we train them on mandatory reporting? Is that flavor, that messaging of supporting the victim in our rules and regulations, or is it all about more of a investigative criminal response and not really acknowledging how important it is from that very moment of disclosure to wrap around a system of care, to be able to support healing and not just who did what and what's going to happen to them, right? Not just the, you know, what do we do about that staff person or that situation that happened? So response, that means changing policies and procedures and practices. Make sure your community-based agencies don't just have a cut and paste of the state regulations. Do they create policies and procedures that fit their needs, who they're serving, their community resources? And was there any input from self-advocates or individuals receiving services from their agencies when this was developed? And so really looking at those opportunities so we make the response that much better. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into sustainability because I know we're butting right there at the end of time. And I really think this is so important. People think about going for grants and that's what's going to change it. And that's a good thing. A grant really started as our foundation of our work, but it didn't end there. There's a lot of things we've done to make it sustainable. I consider them the legacy items that long after our current champions, and I want to tell you that is essential that you have a champion, a whole set of champions, alternate champions for when those folks go on to other responsibilities or other jobs, and then even your auxiliary champions, and those might be the folks that you pull in just when you need to because they have the authority of the agency, you know, to make those type of big policy issues. Changes. And so legislation might be part of it. To give you quick examples that I think were so important in Illinois, one of the first things we did is we changed our Sexual Assault Services Emergency Treatment Act, or SASETA. Prior to our efforts, an individual who had a guardian that was sexually assaulted could not get a rape kit done without guardian consent. As you know, there's all sorts of issues with that. So that was one of the big policy issues that we needed to change on the state level because the community rape crisis centers couldn't change that for us. We also looked at securing rape crisis center records. And so that way a guardian could not access a survivor's records unless it came under a judge's order. We went so far as to start tackling our mental health and developmental disability code. A couple changes we made there was to allow individuals who have guardians to get counseling without guardian consent. And counseling included mental health, substance use, rape crisis center services, as well as domestic violence services. And that was a sad situation when children could access 5 sessions and an adult with a disability that happens to have a guardian couldn't get any of them. So that was one of the changes that was made. And then we built upon that and added even more sessions that are allowable. We also, and this is huge when it comes to educating folks, was as a part of the Mental Health Development and Disability Code is to mandate sexual education, healthy sexual behavior for all individuals receiving services through our developmental disability service system. So whether it be a state operated developmental center or a community-based provider, having sexual education become a requirement is an effort that we're still working on. And much work has been done and much work is able to do. So, you know, contractual language, that's something you can do with all your grantees, insert language that helps make the changes or support the changes you're going. As a part of your monitoring process, make sure that response to sexual assault is built into your monitoring process. Have it a part of your data set. If you measure it, people will.
This is Sandra. Can you slow down just a little bit, please?
Oh, absolutely.
Sorry.
Sorry, running with the time. Partnerships is another thing that is so important because you can't do this alone. Whether you are the state administrator of the mental health system or the developmental disability system, you need your team. That includes the Coalition Against Sexual Assault. It includes other state agencies that have that shared vision with you. That might be a criminal justice authority. It might be Department on Aging, if they're the ones that handle adult protective services. That includes not only older adults, but adults with disabilities, as we do in Illinois from 18 to 59 years old. And it might include, or it should include, self-advocates, not just as token members of a team, but as active participants. So it's really important to make sure that you design your systems change efforts with self-advocates in mind. And what that means is simple things like, when do you hold meetings? Where do you hold meetings? Is it conducive to participation from individuals who aren't paid to be a part of a state agency? And why aren't they paid? Is there a way that you can help support their expertise, much like everyone else that's around the table? That's something we were able to do as a part of our OVW funding. Funding, I know I listed that as a sustainability effort, and you say, well, we don't have enough money now. I guess one of the keys I would say under this is to allow flexible funding. That was one of the things that we noticed was, our centers weren't aware they could use our funding in order to support accessibility enhancements. So whether that be a video relay system, whether that be making some changes to their building in order to be more physically accessible, training of staff in order to address some of the attitudinal barriers or lack of information or communication barriers. So I'm asking you, what kind of barriers stand in your way, and what kind of resources might be needed to improve identification as well as response. So there's a lot of tools, and I saw, Sandra, where you put the website where you can pull down the digital files, and you're going to find on that ICASA website, which is the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault. You will see on that website a lot of tools under Illinois Imagines. That's the name of the initiative that we called ourselves. And you'll see everything from a guide to the rape kit or the sexual assault exam, a guide for SANE nurses, for disability service providers, and for self-advocates. It's for all of us on how to respond and help educate about rape kits. You'll see the communication guide, the picture book that I referenced a minute ago. You'll see a guide for parents and guardians. Another exciting tool is a counseling guide that was developed specifically for rape crisis center counselors to support individuals with intellectual disabilities and autism. So there's just a few of the resources, but I want to move into our challenge. As it was stated at the very beginning of this webinar, it's most important that not only from what you've heard today, but what you brought into this webinar, because you all came with probably a question, an interest, and I hope a passion to make a difference. So what is one thing that you'll do tomorrow, not next week, not a year from now, tomorrow, as a direct result of what you've heard today? You've heard a lot of ideas. You've heard about the issue, the barriers, some solutions, and you know where you sit, what you can do in terms of being a catalyst for change. And I encourage you to be that champion in your state. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa and Sandra and Nancy, and a special thank you to James and Sydney. We would love to hear what your response to this chat. I know that we ran a little bit over today, but as you all know, we just really started the conversation today, the tip of the iceberg, and we invite you all to take this call to action for state agencies away. I'm seeing some really great things in the chat already, but I hope that James and Cindy's commitment to change should be encouraging and motivating us all to, as James says, listen and believe. And as Cindy says, to take your time when you listen. Teresa laid a really nice foundation for states to do this, and we'll provide you with today's PowerPoint, as well as the recording for you to take this back and really sit and find space to think about this and how you're going to make change tomorrow. So thank you again for taking the time for taking collective action towards this important work. Again, thank you, and we hope you all have a wonderful day. We really are very grateful for you and for the work that you do and being able to find the time to be here with us today. Goodbye.